So the reason I'm here today, I did a session yesterday, and I interact quite a bit with those in the public sector, and I know one of the challenges that is occurring today is the fact that we're having multiple different generations entering the workforce. And that's happening everywhere, but it's definitely happening in the public sector. We seem to have a lot of people that were hired maybe back in the 80s that are now heading into retirement or have retired. And so we're getting a lot of younger generations into the workforce. And the question becomes, how do we manage in that environment? So what I want to talk to you today about is managing in these intergenerational workforces. Some ideas and some things that I think you can take away with you that might help you in that environment, regardless of what generation you might be or what your role is. The first thing that crosses my mind, several years ago I took over managing a group of people. There was about, I'd say about 15 procurement folks reporting to me. And I was taking over from my predecessor. She had been with that group for several years. And one of the things she did during my cross-training was she took me into a group meeting. Once a week she had like a team meeting. She'd get everybody together and picture a big boardroom, long table in a U shape. She was at one end and everybody else surrounded the table. When I was in this room, what I noticed is, I'm a very direct person. I can be very to the point if I want to be. She was very much the opposite, very much a social person, liked to talk, liked to chat. So these meetings that were supposed to be an hour long started with her speaking for about 40 minutes. So right away I'm thinking that's not the most effective team meeting. But I listened to her during the first meeting, and she spent quite a bit of time talking through the challenges. And the plan was at the end of her talking, she would go around the room to the other 15 people and see if they had any questions, concerns, or comments that she could elaborate on. What I noticed, because I sat through two of these before I actually took over her role, is that there's a gentleman that sat to her direct right. We'll call him Bob. And Bob was about 59 years of age, been with the company forever, been in the role forever, whereas my predecessor was probably in her late 30s, not been in the role that long, not been in the company that long, and nor had I at the time. So what I noticed was that when she was done and it would go to Bob for his turn to speak, Bob had a stack of papers, he had a pen, and he had a list, right? Numerous issues he wanted to talk about. And because Bob's personality was that he was very direct, he would just jump right into the list. What about this? You told us this a couple weeks ago, where's that at? Are you progressing with changing the software? Have we changed the forms? When are we going to have our Christmas party? Whatever it was, Bob had a list of issues. Now, I think to the detriment of my predecessor, she would then elaborate whether she had meaningful information to share or not. She would elaborate on every one of his points, and that would burn up the rest of the 20 minutes. So that when, in the last 5 minutes of the meeting, she'd go around to the other 14 people, did anybody have questions? But then people just wanted to get out of the room, and hence it was a no, 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 no. So the first time I witnessed this, I thought, okay, if she could cut back maybe and let the people bring out the issues, that might work better. But the second time I sat through it, what I noticed was people referred back to Bob. They would say things like, Bob already covered it. Bob already addressed it. And so I learned quickly that as I take on this role, Bob was kind of seen as the unofficial leader. And if I thought about Bob and his generation, Bob was of the baby boomer generation. And I'll define, I'm sure you've heard about the different generations. I'll define them shortly here. But Bob was of the baby boomer generation, which typically likes formality and structure. It's one of the key attributes. So Bob was very prepared, and he liked that meeting, but he wanted to make sure he had a say, so he sat right next to her because he realized it might not make it around to him if he sat over here. And everybody let him do that. He was very good at what he did. So when you start to think about how effective it was, the communication between my predecessor and Bob, and then I took over the role, what I ended up doing is started to work with Bob very closely, recognizing, again, his generation, and recognizing he liked formality and structure, and he seemed to be an unofficial team leader. I spent time speaking with Bob offside, before meetings. Bob, what kinds of issues do you have for this meeting? Bob would tell me, and guess what? Those issues became, for me, my issues. I started structuring my meeting around Bob's issues. I talked less, that's just my style, my personal style, and there wasn't much else to talk about. So what I want to suggest to you today is that if we start to consider the different generations that we're interacting with and we know a little bit about those generations, and we actually stop for a moment and take some time to think about how we can interact with those generations, we can be a lot more effective. Sorry, there's a squeak here. Today, in the multi-generational workforces, there's a lot of challenges that are really coming out, right, that are really impacting us. And there's really two big outcomes when we're in such a diverse community of people that we're trying to work with and get along with day to day. First of all, we often have a lack of communication. What I mean by that is we're unable to understand the true meaning behind what other people are trying to tell us. And that leads to all sorts of problems. The other side is we really often have a lack of understanding amongst employees and amongst people. General understanding. Misinterpretation about what people's views are, what their thoughts are, what their interpretations are, what their goals are. If you're trying to manage people and you're not considering generations and not considering what's important to that generation, you're going to have a difficult time engaging and motivating that individual. And when you have those two factors in place, both of them in place at the same time, there's only three possible outcomes. There's often conflict in the workplace. There's poor morale in the workplace. And in some cases, reduced productivity. You know, I think back, when you think about generations, the easiest way to look at the differences is to think about your parents, right? Definitely of a different generation, typically, than yourself. And I recall when I was young, when I was a teenager, I had a part-time job, so in the summertime I'd often work till 11 or 12 o'clock at night. I'd come home and go to bed. But every morning my mom went to work at about 9 o'clock. She'd leave about 8:30 to get to work by 9. And every morning about 7:30, she would come into my room. So I had the blinds down, door closed and locked, and she found if she got a nail, she could push it through the hole of the door lock, unlock the door, and come into the room. And she was very task-oriented. So, you know, Thursdays she dusted, and Fridays she put laundry in the room, whatever it was. But regardless of what her task was, she always found a reason to come into my room about 7:30 in the morning. And you have to understand, in her room, she had the radio going, blaring, right? So as soon as that door opened, here comes the noise of the local radio station. And she would walk in, and she'd snap that blind up and start talking to me like I'd been awake for hours. Meanwhile, the covers are over my head. So when I think about that circumstance, the outcomes of that were often similar to what we're talking about here today. Some days, I'd be overtired, I'd be upset, and what would happen is she'd leave the room for a moment, because eventually she would leave and she'd close the door. But when she'd leave for a moment, I'd get up, I'd pull the blind, I'd lock the door and get back into bed. And if she'd come back in, I'd be angry, right? That's the conflict side of it. Other times what would happen is, later on that night, maybe at dinner time when she'd come home, we'd have a discussion. And I'd say, look, why do you keep coming into my room all the time? I was up last night till midnight, I was working, I didn't get into bed till 1, you're in my room at 7 o'clock in the morning. And we'd have a discussion, but really my morale was low. I wasn't that pleased with her actions. And be darned if I could change her. So thinking back now, to my detriment, what I realize is this, that my mother grew up in a family of 6. So what would happen is every morning, if you're in a family of 6, the 3 girls would get up to do laundry, to get breakfast, to get lunches made, whatever it was, and the 3 boys went out to the barn. Back then, pretty much everybody had a farm, at least where I'm from, and their farm was just to provide for the family. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, year-round, there was something to do. So she got up every day to go to work at 5:30 in the morning because that was her habit. That's what she grew up in. That's from her generation. And she felt indirectly, I should be doing the same. So that's why she came into my room every morning at that time. Now, at the time, I didn't think about it that way, but looking back at the different generational patterns, you can start to understand why that occurred. So coming back to the public sector and the attrition we're seeing, I mean, it's only going to increase over the next 10 years. Now, how many people in this room today in the next 10 years expect to be retired? Raise your hands. Would that be 35% maybe? 30 to 40% of the room? So that has a significant impact. Now, some of you are cheering, I see in the back there. That's going to have a big impact on the public sector, and I'm generalizing here, but it'll have a significant impact, and I'll talk to you later about specifically one of the biggest impacts I see that probably isn't within the power of the people in this room, but it's going to have an impact, and it's going to change public sector forever, but I'll touch on that shortly. Before I go further, I think it's important just to put into context 4 of the different generations that we're dealing with today, in case you're not really familiar with them. I'll just spend a few minutes talking those through. First of all, think about, you've got the baby boomers. Now, if you study this stuff at all, you know there's the traditionalists, right? So I'm not going to talk about them because most of them aren't working today. Unfortunately, some of them aren't here today at all. So the traditionalists are pre-1942, okay? And I'm not going to worry about them. But in the workforce today, we have a lot of baby boomers still. These are people born between 42 and 62. And it's important, rather than I tell you, well, here's what they like and here's what they don't like, think about the events that shaped their life. So baby boomers, they experienced things like the Civil Rights Movement while they were growing up, the Cold War, and space travel. Those are three significant events in their life when they were growing up that, believe it or not, had an impact on who they are today. When you think about, and studies have been done, relative to boomers, they like formality, they like structure, right? Probably coming from their traditionalist parents who were born into structure. So someone who is a baby boomer would function very well in an organization where there's a manager, senior manager, team lead, etc. Or if you're looking at making a change or working on a project, a baby boomer is someone who likes structure. Don't bring them an abstract. Don't say, I've got this idea. What do you think? Right? They don't want that. They want to say, what's the idea? What's the boundaries? How might we approach this? Next, you have Generation X. I guess I am Generation X, part of Generation X, born between 62 and 82. Some of the significant events that impacted those baby boomers were AIDS, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Challenger disaster, and Desert Storm. Right? So many of you in that generation recall those events very clearly in your mind growing up. And again, indirectly, those have an influence on who we are today. So Generation X tend to expect quick recognition for their accomplishments. And what they enjoy is having rewards and opportunities to grow. And they like to work in environments where they can reach consensus. So if you're trying to motivate and engage someone in Generation X, you need to keep that in mind. They're not so worried about formal structure. They're okay with working in a group and coming to consensus on decisions. They don't do well if you come forward and say, this is what we're doing. It makes me think of when I was growing up. I have a friend down the road, good friend. Come the weekend, right, Friday night, we'd be hanging out, playing, doing something. I go back to my parents, says, first of all, I'd be at his house usually because he had a pool. And his parents would say, Shawn, you want to stay over for the night? I'd say, absolutely. They said, well, you better go talk to your parents. So I'd run down the road, go to my parents' house, go in the house. Mom, Dad, first I'll usually start with Dad. Dad, is it okay if I spend the night down the road here at Greg's house? Say, what do you think Dad said? I don't know, ask your mother. Right? So go down to my mother, and no word of a lie, go down to her, say, Mom, how do you think I'd position it? Just talk to Dad. He's cool with me spending the night at Greg's house. Just want to make sure you're okay with it. And my mom, not every time, but I would say at least half the time would say, no. And I would say, why? And we talk about this today. Her answer was always, because. And after hearing that for several years, I started to get really upset. I'd say, because why? And she'd say, eventually, she'd say, because I said so. Now, to this day, I still don't know. I think she must have felt I was intruding. I don't know what her reasoning was. But when I think back to that moment, and I kind of tie it in, when she grew up, you didn't spend a lot of time at your friend's house. You were at home with your brothers and sisters. So you can see where that opinion of hers that, if you're spending every Friday night down there, you're intruding, starts to come about. Again, generational differences, right? Not something we would normally lay on the table and think about. Now then we come to Generation Y. Generation Y was born between 82 and 2002. Also referred to as millennials is the more common title for that generation. And the events that have shaped their lives are 9/11, the Iraq War, and the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. They have really come to expect to be viewed as peers. They're the farthest from being receptive to that formal structure. They see people on an equal playing ground. And they're also prefer to be working in a casual style, right? If I go into workplaces today and I see younger people, not everyone, but more often than not, I'll see them wanting to dress in jeans and golf shirt, T-shirt, and it's Friday afternoon, 4, 3, 2, whatever, I got to take off. I'll come in early Monday. And if you were to say no, it'd be shocking, right? Because casual style, that's what I expect. Why do we have to be so stringent? As long as I put the hours in. In fact, as long as I get the work done, why does it matter what time I work to and from? That's millennials. So the last generation, and I won't elaborate on them too much because they're really just started, or they're not really a formal title yet, but Gen Z, or I think they're called pluralists, are the newer generation, 2002 to today so far. And I think the most significant attribute of this generation is they're really born into technology. They're very connected. I mean, my oldest son is almost 4 today. Well, yeah, almost 4 as of today. And my wife said to me a couple weeks ago, she said, Shawn, we have to get Matthew a laptop. Now, I live from my laptop. That's where I do all my work. And I have one. So I said, well, why would we need to get him a laptop? And she said, well, if you go in, he goes to preschool a couple days a week, they've got computers, and kids play on them. His number one activity when he sees me is to take this, and he always has one of 2 questions. Dad, can I look at pictures of your snowmobile? Dad, can I play Angry Birds? My wife told me the other day, we have to buy Matthew an iPad. I said, I don't have an iPad. Why would I get Matthew an iPad? When we think about motivation, and I want to talk about motivation for a minute, but we think about motivation in the workplace, again, think about the generational differences. Back when I was young, I sold cars for, I guess about a summer, about 4 months one summer when I was young. Worked for, if you've ever been around an automotive dealership at all, actually worked there, it can kind of be a nasty environment sometimes, right? A lot of tension, a lot of emotions. You're either really excited or people are really angry, right? So what happened was I had this lady come in. I'd been dealing with her, young girl, probably close to my age actually, looking for a car. She liked, at the time it was a Pontiac Vibe. She really wanted one. She kept coming back and looking at it, bringing in her boyfriend. But she lived out of town. So she come up one weekend, and I thought, well, she's going to buy one eventually, I'm sure. She come up one weekend and said, look, I've got a price on a Pontiac Vibe from another dealer where she was from, and here's the price. If you can match it, I like that one out there, I'll take it. So I wanted to make the sale. Sure enough, we worked it through. I got approval of my sales manager, made the deal. So I'm pumped, right? Saturday, I'm leaving. I sold the car. The owner of the dealership's going to be happy. I go in to give him the finance paperwork. He ripped the strip off me. He said, Shawn, what are you doing? I said, I sold the car. He said, yeah, but the price she gave you was for a Pontiac Vibe that's burnt orange in color. You just sold her the same car in blue. Do you know the differences between how many people buy a burnt orange car versus a blue car? So he says, she kind of took you to the cleaners there. You should have actually upped your price because you're selling her something that's more common. He wasn't real happy. So I went home that night. I was ticked off because when you're expecting to end the day on a high note, you ended on a low note. That's not very pleasing. Told my parents the story. My dad said, well, I can understand your frustration. But he said, let me ask you something. Last Thursday, did you get paid? I said, yeah. He says, do you think, even though this happened, next Thursday you'll get paid? I said, of course. He says, well, there's your recognition. If you've got a job and you're still getting paid, that should be enough. And that was his belief. I thought he was out to lunch, right? Generational differences. So if we recognize that there are differences between people, between the generations specifically, and we think about motivation, the first thing that comes to mind for me, and maybe for many of you, is Hertzberg's theory of motivation, right? We all learned it in school, whether it's university, college, or even in high school. Been around for a long time. And that theory tells us how to motivate people. And Hertzberg based his theory on the fact that there was 2 real elements to motivating employees. There was hygiene factors, and there was motivational factors. Hygiene factors, and this has maybe taken some of you back, hygiene factors were those things that if they were present, people were content. But if they weren't present, they were actually demotivated. Motivational factors were things that actually increased people's performance. So in essence, those hygiene factors are just basic expectations of a job. Motivational factors were those things layered on top of that started to increase performance. So he said back then that hygiene factors are things like pay, benefits, And the motivational factors were things more like achievement and recognition. But the problem is this: Hertzberg created that theory in 1959. He was a traditionalist. And he created that at a time when people were working in dingy buildings on dirt floors making 10 cents a week. Now, I would tell you most of that still applies today, but I think we could update it a little bit. And I think it's important we do so, because before we talk about really engaging and motivating, we need to understand those basic factors that influence such. So, for example, if you think about hygiene factors, in today's environment, I would suggest to you that hygiene factors are things like basic requirements, benefits. You know, I realize there's exceptions, but most people today, when you take a job, you expect there's going to be a benefits package. Most people, when you take a job today, expect you're going to have at least a couple weeks holidays plus stat holidays. Now, again, retail may differ. There are some exceptions, but in general terms, those are our hygiene factors today. You expect to make minimum wage, right? Relative to motivational factors, again, we can kind of up from where Hertzberg was and say, well, things that motivate people today are flex time, right? If I want to take a couple hours off, as long as I make up later, that's fine. Some sort of support relative to retirement, whether it be a pension, which are becoming more rare, obviously, but some sort of savings plan or something for retirement. Could be some sort of support relative to a fitness membership or anything around personal support and well-being for the people, right? So those are more motivational factors. So what we can say is if this was what Hertzberg said was a hygiene factor and this was a motivational factor, they've moved up a level. So, and just before I move on, when you talk about how things have changed and the environment that Hertzberg created this in, it makes me think about my uncle. For years, I mean, he's in his 80s now and worked in a factory for many, many years. And he's talked for years. Every Christmas I see him, and it always comes up some story from his working days. And it's clear he just hated his job, absolutely hated it. And so about 2 years ago, he got into another story, and I was there. And, you know, I said to him, I got to ask the question, why did you work there for 30-some years if you absolutely hated it? He said, well, Shawn, he kind of laughed. He said, because of the pension. I get a pension which guaranteed me income for life. I said, well, you know, I guess so. I mean, but how did you know then if that pension would be worth something? And he broke out laughing. He says, Shawn, do you know what that pension's worth today? And meanwhile, he's been retired for about 19 years. I said, no. He said, every month I collect a check from that company in the amount of $263. I said, wow, was it worth it? He said, absolutely not. Right? Different generational influences. Back when he was working, and especially early on in his employment, $263 was a lot of money every month. So if we think about the changes in motivational factors and how they influence us today, we have to start to kind of bring this together. As individuals, it's difficult to motivate others. You can't go out tomorrow and necessarily change the pay scale of somebody. You can't just provide them an extra week of holidays. It's pretty difficult to do. But we need to start with how do we motivate employees? How do we motivate others in the workplace? What matters to us today? And then we start to look at the different generations we're working in and how to interact with those generations. So some questions that we want to give consideration to. What's the best means to effectively communicate with these different generations? Well, you start with baby boomers, right? Face-to-face. You can email. I would never text message, but face-to-face is the most effective. You have something you really want to say that's really important, you got to see them face-to-face. And I'm sure you know that. Indirectly, you're sitting there and you're thinking, I have to go see someone, and without even really considering what you're thinking, I better go see them face-to-face. And most often, that's because of the generational difference. Now, if you look, as far as communication goes, and you want to be effective, you look at the Generation X, email is probably more common. I worked in a company where everything was emailed. You would get pages of emails. Procedures were in emails. Everything was email. But I was okay with that because I'm of the email generation. It was created when I was younger, and I was raised into that. If those kind of emails go to somebody who's Generation X, or heaven forbid, a traditionalist, most of them can't even turn on the computer. So, again, Generation X, email, they're much more comfortable with email. You can send much more important messages in email, and they'll interpret what you're saying very well. And if they don't, they'll make the effort to come to you face-to-face. Now, Generation Y, a little bit different. They're used to texting, right? I did a session a few weeks ago in Calgary, And we were talking about the younger generation and how they're kind of addicted to texting. And what she mentioned to me was she thought texting was really good. She said she sat at the table across from her daughter, and they texted each other, and they had an argument through texting. And she said, it worked really well. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, there was no real emotion. She said, I glared at her a few times, but I texted my points. She texted hers. We worked it out. And I said, okay. But I said, would you consider yourself more of a direct person, kind of abrupt, or indirect and kind of social? And she said, no, I'm definitely more direct. I said, would you consider your daughter to be more direct or more social? And she said, my daughter's more direct. I said, so then direct people want to communicate in shorter bursts, so texting might work. And because your daughter and you have a history, know each other well, know each other emotionally, you're both very direct, texting worked in that scenario. But can you imagine sitting down with someone else who you didn't know very well trying to have an argument through text? Wouldn't work, would it? So when we're talking about generations, it's only one of many filters that we have to consider. But again, different generations communicate effectively in different means. If you then think about how do we really motivate these different generations? What can you do if you're not leading a team of people, you're just working in this kind of environment? How do you really motivate these people, these different generations? Well, it starts with thinking about the different generations and what's meaningful to them. So if I was dealing with, as I mentioned earlier, someone who's a baby boomer, and I wanted to motivate them, I would try and give them projects, try and have our discussions and hold our discussions with structure. I'm not going to give them the abstract. I'm going to try and give them something that I've already considered. I've worked in environments where stuff simply gets passed on. Here's a problem, and it gets passed down the line. Well, if that ends up with somebody who's a baby boomer and no one has taken time to consider this and construct this, it doesn't go over well. They don't want the abstract. They want somebody to give them the framework that they can work within. Now, if I'm looking at someone who's more Generation X, how do I motivate them? I put them more into a group scenario where the group can come to consensus. I try and let the group work problems out. Because if I was a leader to that group or a team lead or a project lead on something and I'm trying to enforce them to do certain things, that's not going to go over well. Remember I said earlier, the farther away you get from the traditionalists, the less comfortable people are with that formal structure. So if I let them work in a group environment and come to consensus, it's going to be a more effective outcome, and they're going to be more motivated to participate. Now, if you come to the Gen Y, how might I motivate Gen Y? Well, Generation Y, or the millennials, are a very different animal. If you think about them today, I did a session in Atlanta in December, and there was a bunch of very large companies there, and a vice president from a large oil rigging company, if you will, stood up and said that for their younger generation workers coming into their workforce today, they've had to create their own interpersonal skills training. Because the younger generation, and I'm sure I saw it on the way here, I was thinking about it, you'll see them sitting next to one another, texting each other. Right? Somebody right now in this audience is sitting there texting someone at their table about something, guaranteed. Because that's the way they're comfortable communicating. Companies today have actually put instant messaging in to try and cater to the younger generation, how they prefer to communicate. But in this case, this company had put in interpersonal skills training because he said they found time and time again that although they would communicate almost anything in a text message, to sit down in front of someone that they didn't know well and have a meaningful discussion was very challenging. And those aren't skills that they're being taught. So again, if I'm looking at a Gen Y, how do I motivate them in that kind of environment? What I would do is try and make sure that I'm providing them more abstract, putting them in a diverse group of people, possibly including technology, if it makes sense to do so, and letting them come to some sort of result. Again, less structure than the Gen X. And then lastly, the pluralists, or the Gen Z, I mean, they're not really in the workforce today, but if we think about the differences there, again, that's going to be a whole other animal. So the last question that comes to mind for me then is, how do I really sustain this? I think I can motivate them. I know how to communicate effectively. How can I really sustain this over the long term? Well, first of all, if you look at the examples we just gave, if you start to place people in a position of making group decisions or group decision making, you're going to have a better chance at motivating and engaging those people, letting them come to decisions as a group rather than enforcing decisions. If you also choose to communicate in a variety of messages. When I had a team of people that were of differing generations, we would have a face-to-face meeting. I would typically follow that up with an email and then have some informal discussions with people that I knew would be more comfortable in that ground, right? Typically maybe Generation X, baby boomers, for example. So when you're communicating, you can't just take your preferred form of communication because it won't always be received as you intended it. And lastly, you want to make sure that you think about how do I cater to individual needs while still managing the group's expectations. So just before I wrap up here, I just wanted to kind of give you something else I thought I should mention. I do a little bit of teaching, and I've been teaching periodically an undergrad course. And the first time I ever went into the classroom, so picture it's theater style, raised seats, I'm down on the bottom. And I go in, the students come in, it's what you would expect, dressed the way I'd expect, they all had a backpack. What do you think the first thing they pulled out was? Laptop. Every one of them, every one of these 40 people had a laptop. And the first thing they did was open it up. So as I looked up above me, all I saw were the backs of laptops with the odd face peeking over. Instantly, I thought, what is this? They're playing games, they're messaging one another, they're not paying attention. So as I started to speak, I started to move around the room and look at what they were doing. They were taking notes. No different than I would have taken notes, but I would have used a pad of paper. Generational differences at work. And if I would have initially run with my intuition that this is wrong, they're doing something wrong, I'm looking at it from my perspective, not their perspective. So there's three things I want you to keep in mind as you go forth relative to the work environment that you're in today. First of all, consider that your preferred style of communication, meaning the one that you default to without thinking about it, is most likely not effective. If you're not stopping and thinking about how do I best communicate with this person based on their generation, as well as other factors, you're most likely not going to be as effective as you'd like to be. Secondly, and I'll start this with a saying I heard once I've never forgot. We were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Right? We tend to use them in the opposite order. If we listen more than we speak, we can learn a lot of information about people, what motivates them, allowing us to go forward and actually engage with them on an effective level. And the last thing I want to leave you with is this. If you think about some of the qualities of the younger generation that I've touched on, and you think about the structure in the public sector today, there's going to be continued significant changes over the next 10 to 15 years, much of which many of us in this room can't really impact, but it's coming. So if you're out there, speaking to a few people yesterday that were saying, oh, we're in a bunch of change, hopefully this will calm down. It's not calming down. It's going to continue to change. And as far as communicating and interacting in these intergenerational workforces, that's going to continue. So we have to stop and think about what we're saying and how we're interacting with people to be most effective. So I want to leave you with this last thought. If you're not prepared or willing to interact with others on their level, and always keeping in mind what's in their preference and what's in their best interest, you're not going to achieve your objectives. Whether it's something simple, like just partnering with somebody, asking them a question, or if it's something more complex, like trying to manage that individual. So always give thought to how you're communicating, how it fits in the other person's best interest, and I can guarantee you, you'll have better communications regardless of the generational styles. Thank you very much.